Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast, where ideas are framed, reimagined, and explored in ways that provoke thought long after the conversation ends. Today, we're reflecting on how the concept of framing has evolved, from the deliberate, lasting acts of preserving memories in worn photo albums to the fleeting, ever-changing moments shared and reshaped in the digital world. In the 1980s, photo albums embodied more than mere collections of images. They captured the texture of memory, weighted by the deliberate act of preserving fleeting moments. My mum's albums, worn and slightly frayed, carried a tactile story, every crinkled plastic sheet and yellowing adhesive a testament to time's quiet passing. Unlike today's ceaseless digital streams, these albums required pause, each page demanding reflection, each photograph chosen with intention. One album in particular remains vivid in my mind. Its deep navy blue cover, weathered around the edges, evokes the familiar comfort of something often held but never discarded. Inside, snapshots of everyday life unfold. There's a photo of me on a bike, clad in sandals and long socks, a quintessential relic of the late 1970s. A series of frames captures my third birthday, chronicling a gleeful child smeared with cake, oblivious to anything beyond that sugary indulgence. And then there's the image of my granddad, standing resolute in the garden with autumn's golden hues as his backdrop. He holds my toddler brother, his quiet strength grounding the frame, not just in the past, but in memory itself. Flipping through these albums today evokes something that digital scrolling can't replicate. There's no rush, the pages resist haste. Every photograph demands time, not only to see but to feel. The weight of the album, the gloss of prints beneath clear plastic, the soft creak of stiff pages, they anchor you, making the act of remembering tactile, immersive. These weren't moments captured on impulse. They were chosen, printed, placed deliberately, and in doing so, transformed into stories worth holding. Another album, bound in white faux leather, marks a different chapter. I didn't notice the shift at the time, but in hindsight, it's clear this was from my mum's second marriage. The photos inside tell quieter stories, filled with faded hues of family holidays by cold English beaches. There's a picture of my mum squinting slightly, her hair caught in a wind that's invisible yet present in the frame. My sister, bundled in a thick fleece onesie, looks on wide-eyed, oblivious to the grey chill of the shore. The colours may have faded, but these frames retain their warmth, not through vibrancy, but through the quiet permanence of being chosen. These albums were never about capturing everything. They were about framing what mattered. Each photo required patience. Each frame carried the weight of anticipation, waiting for the roll to finish, for the prints to develop, for that breathless moment when you finally held them in hand. Some were blurred, imperfect, yet they were kept, not deleted. Because they weren't just images, they were fragments of meaning, shaped by the hand that framed them. This way of framing life wasn't born in the modern era. It echoes something older, something rooted in a tradition where every image was carefully constructed, not merely captured. The Renaissance taught us that the art wasn't just about recording what existed. It was about shaping how existence was remembered. Artists didn't aim for simple representation. They layered meaning into every detail, embedding intention into every stroke of the brush. Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam on the Sistine Chapel's ceiling is a prime example. More than an illustration of a biblical moment, it's a study of potential, connection, and the fragile distance between divine power and human frailty. The two hands suspended in that charged moment before contact hold more than physical tension. They capture a philosophical reflection on life, on creation itself. Every fold of God's robe, every curve of Adam's form is intentional, designed to evoke awe, to endure beyond the moment of its creation. This wasn't art meant to pass quickly before the eyes. It was meant to hold the viewer, to make them linger in thought. Framing was, at its core, an attempt at permanence. The artist didn't just create a picture, they created meaning, anchored in time, meant to be contemplated long after their hand left the canvas. This ethos didn't end with the brush. When the camera emerged, early photographers embraced the same philosophy. Though their medium was mechanical, their process was deliberate. Framing remained a craft, something done with care and thought. They didn't point and shoot without consequence. Each image was selected, each subject considered, knowing that every frame carried a story. Yet with the arrival of photography came something new, the ability to replicate images endlessly. A photograph could be reproduced without the artist's touch, democratizing the act of framing. Suddenly, moments weren't just preserved for a few, they were made accessible to many. But in this accessibility lay a tension. Framing, once tied to permanence, began to shift towards something more fluid. As photos multiplied, their meaning became less fixed. Frames were no longer singular, they began to move with the world, shaped not only by the creator's hand, but by the context in which they were viewed. Walter Benjamin, a critical voice of the early 20th century, recognized this shift in his reflections on photography and art. He argued that mechanical reproduction stripped art of its aura, that unique presence tied to an original work. Where once a painting held a singular, unrepeatable essence, photography introduced a world where images could be multiplied, their significance scattered across countless iterations. What had once been bound tightly to a particular moment in time now became untethered, floating freely through different contexts and interpretations. At first, this democratization felt liberating. Photography allowed ordinary people to frame their own lives, to create personal archives of meaning. But with each frame came an erosion of permanence. What had once been an act of careful preservation became something more transient, a fleeting capture rather than an enduring monument. Frames became moments to be glanced at, not paused over. Meaning once anchored in the weight of physical albums and single originals began to drift, no longer held by the frame itself, but by how it was experienced in passing. Today, this drift has become a flood. The smartphone, always at hand, has turned framing into an almost instinctive reflex. Photos are taken, shared, and forgotten in seconds, their meaning determined less by their content and more by their fleeting place in a continuous stream. A frame no longer anchors memory, it becomes part of a perpetual flow. Its purpose isn't to endure, but to move, to flash by, to be consumed and replaced. In this digital landscape, the very concept of framing has transformed. It's no longer an act of singular creation, but a fleeting gesture, a brief invitation for engagement. The frame is fluid, shaped less by the person who takes the photo and more by those who react to it. Its meaning doesn't rest in permanence, but in how it interacts with the moment, how it provokes a response, sparks a thought, or momentarily connects people before vanishing into the endless current of new images. This shift reflects something deeper in our culture. Where once we sought to frame reality with permanence, we now frame it in flux. We no longer expect frames to last. Instead, we participate in their continuous reinterpretation, knowing that meaning isn't anchored but constantly remade. Frames today aren't crafted for eternity. They're crafted for motion. They exist to connect, to be shared, and then to fade. Their significance found not in their longevity, but in their brief ability to spark a moment of understanding before they're gone. In this fluid age, the boundaries between creator and audience have dissolved. A frame no longer belongs solely to its maker. It's reshaped by everyone who encounters it. A single photo can splinter into countless interpretations, each iteration offering something new. Meaning is no longer dictated by the creator's intent, but emerges from how the image is shared, reframed, and reimagined by others. It becomes less a fixed statement and more an ongoing conversation. Take the viral meme of a woman pointing angrily at a cat seated before a plate of food. What began as two unrelated images, one a snapshot of a heated moment from a reality TV show, the other a simple photo of an unbothered cat, was fused by online culture into something entirely different. Through captions and remixes, it evolved into a meme capable of expressing absurdity, frustration, or humor, depending on how it was framed. The original context faded into irrelevance, replaced by an ever-expanding series of reinterpretations that transformed it into a digital icon. Its meaning now lives in the collective imagination of those who continually reshape it. This isn't just a quirk of internet culture, it's a defining feature of how we engage with media today. Whether it's a viral image, a post, or a fleeting clip, content rarely remains static. It mutates as it moves, adapted by those who interact with it. Frames become part of a networked process, their meaning co-created by countless hands and eyes. What they signify isn't fixed, it shifts with each new layer of context, each new voice that engages with them. This transition from permanence to motion has created a different kind of creativity. Today's frames aren't meant to endure unchanged. They're designed to ignite interaction. They're sparks, moments crafted not to stand still, but to provoke, to circulate, to be endlessly reimagined. Meaning no longer rests in preserving a frame, it thrives in its movement, in the way it's shared and reshaped. Frames now invite connection, participation, and transformation. Their power lies not in holding time still, but in keeping the conversation alive, in perpetually becoming something new. And now, even the act of creation itself has been redefined. The rise of AI-generated art has made framing infinitely replicable, shifting the process from craftsmanship to computation. With tools like Dolly and Midjourney, images can be summoned in seconds, conjured by algorithms trained on vast archives of human visual culture. What once required an artist's intuition and labour now requires only a prompt and a machine's processing power. This ease of creation introduces a paradox. When frames can be produced so effortlessly, so abundantly, do they still hold meaning? The deliberate act of choosing what to frame is lost in the flood of infinite possibilities. The frame becomes less about intention and more about abundance, a sea of images, each one replaceable by the next. Even as these systems generate endless novelty, they often draw on familiar compositions, echoing styles so often that developers must intervene to prevent over-repetition. What was once revered for its singularity risks becoming mundane through sheer ubiquity. Yet, in this flood of frames, meaning doesn't vanish, it shifts. It's no longer anchored in the act of creating the frame, but in how people engage with it. Just as my mum's photo albums invite reflection through their physicality, today's digital frames invite interaction through their fluidity. Meaning isn't found in the permanence of an image, but in its ability to spark something, an emotion, a thought, a response. Thank you for listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast, an audio essay read by Holly, our digital narrator. Until next time.